Let's make Africa the tree of life. Let's make Africa the tree of life.
Hello, welcome to Josh Moment. So, if you are new to the channel and you don't know what this channel does, this channel talks about Africa's history. And in today's episode, we'll be looking at Apartheid, South Africa. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, and share this video. Let's start today's episode. So, Apartheid, the institutionalized system of racial segregation and oppression in South Africa, was not a sudden historical development, but the culmination and brutal formalization of decades of discriminatory legislation. This presentation argues the systems rooted in the political and economic reality of white minority rule constituted a totalizing legal and social framework designed to maintain power and control. It will demonstrate how this architecture of oppression created vast, quantifiable inequalities in wealth, education, and opportunity, which ultimately made the regime politically and economically unsustainable. The dismantling of apartheid was the result of a multifaceted struggle, combining a radicalizing internal resistance with a robust international campaign of boycotts and sanctions. However, the analysis of modern South Africa reveals that the legislative framework of apartheid, even though removed, its deeply or its legacies of socioeconomic and psychological effects continue to persist or define the nation South Africa even to this day. So the persistence of extreme inequality, the failure of critical reparative programs, and the ongoing challenge to social cohesion demonstrate that the end of apartheid was a starting point, not a conclusion. This presentation highlights the South African experience as a profound and cautionary case study on the enduring consequences of a system built on legalized racism and exploitation. So let's look at the origins and institutionalization of apartheid. So the former system of apartheid, instituted by the National Party in 1948, was not an abrupt historical anomaly, but a ruthless refinement of a century-long trajectory of racialized legislation. Long before the term apartheid was officially coined, a series of laws and policies systematically dispossessed and marginalized the non-white majority. The Native Land Act of 1913 was a landmark piece of legislation that limited land ownership by black people to a meager 8% of the country's land area, a figure later slightly expanded to 13% by the Native Trust and Land Act of 1936. This deliberate concentration of the majority of the population on a small fraction of the most unproductive land was a fundamental tool of control and a precursor to the geographic engineering of apartheid. So beyond land, the political rights of non-white South Africans were systematically eroded. The Representation of Native Act of 1936, for example, removed black voters from the common voter roll in Cape Colony. So that was the name South Africa had before the unification in 1910, placing them on a separate ineffectual roll that allowed them to elect only a handful of representatives. This act effectively stripped a significant portion of the black population of its political voice. Further, early passed laws, some of which dated back to 1828, severely restricted the mobility of black people, requiring them to carry documents authorizing their presence in restricted areas. These regulations established a pattern of social and physical control that would later become a hallmark of the apartheid regime. The historical context indicates that these pre-1948 laws were not isolated discriminatory acts, but a systematic effort by the white minority to consolidate political and economic control. Even before the former Union of South Africa was created in 1910, the just predominance of the white race was a precondition for peace negotiations in the Treaty of Vereeniging, demonstrating that the roots of institutionalized racism were deeply and consensually embedded in the country's early governance. This long history of legal racialized subjugation shows that the Nationalist Party's policies were brutal and ideological refinement of existing practices rather than an entirely new concept. So let's look at the formalization of apartheid and the rise of the National Party. So the election of the Nationalist Party in 1948 marked a critical turning point in South African history. While previous government had enacted segregationist policies, the Nationalist Party came to power with a clear and comprehensive mandate to formalize and extend these practices into a rigid legal system known as apartheid, an African word which means apartness. This election, carried out by an all-white electorate, was a deliberate shift from a collection of discriminatory laws to a single totalizing legal framework. The institutionalization of apartheid was a calculated response to the need for a comprehensive system to maintain white minority rule in the face of a vastly largely and increasing restive non-white population. So the use of the term apartheid itself was a deliberate ideological branding that centralized and formalized the previously desperate segregationist efforts into a coherent and ruthless enforced national policy. So let's look at the legal pillars which apartheid rested on. So the legislative framework of apartheid was a sophisticated interlocking system of control, with each law reinforcing the other to create an inescapable web of oppression. This architecture transformed racial prejudice into a legal and social reality, governing every aspect of a non-white person's life. The foundational piece of legislation was the Population Registration Act of 1950. This act required every South African to be classified into one of a number of racial population groups. And these racial population groups included white, colored, Bantu, or Black South African. Bantu meant Black South African, and later Asian. This classification served as a master key for the entire system, determining an individual's rights, freedom, and opportunities. The process of classification was often humiliating and relied on pseudo-scientific methods, such as the infamous pencil test, which could lead to families being split and individuals being wrongly categorized, with the devastating consequences. Once a person was classified, their lives was dictated by a cascade of other laws. The Group Areas Act of 1950, for instance, established segregational residential and business areas, or established segregation in residential and business areas, forcing millions of non-white South Africans to relocate to designated township or homelands. This was completed by the promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act of 1959, which created Bantustans for Black Africans, effectively stripping them of their South African citizenship. So even though they were in South Africa, they were not considered as South Africans. And making them citizens of these ethnically defined areas, often irrespective of actual resistance, regardless of where a black South African was residing. Because of the Bantu stance, they were not regarded as South African citizens. So social and personal life was also under strict government control. The Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act of 1949 and the Immorality Amendment Act of 1950 banned interracial marriage and sexual relationships. The Reservation of Separate Amenities Act of 1953 legalized segregated public facilities and notoriously allowed for these separate facilities to be unequal. So in looking at the pillars on which apartheid rested, finally, the education system was designed to ensure social stratification. The Bantu Education Act of 1953 mandated that black children receive an inferior education with a curriculum specifically designed to limit their potential and prepare them for manual and menial labor. This policy was reinforced by the extension of University Education Act of 1959, which prohibited non-white students from attending established universities. This complex, mutually reinforcing legal architecture transformed racial prejudice into an inescapable totalizing system of power and control. So let's look at the realities of socioeconomic and human impact during the apartheid system. So the grand design of spatial and human fragmentation, the legal architecture of apartheid, was a tool for a larger project of human and geographic fragmentation. The Group Areas Act was not just a law on paper. It was a mechanism for large-scale social engineering. Between 1960 and 1983, over 3.5 million black South Africans were forcibly removed from their homes and relocated to segregated neighborhoods, making it one of the largest mass evictions in modern history. These forced removals were designed to concentrate non-white population in designated Bantustans or township. So the non-white populations were condemned to the Bantustans or the townships, which were often on barren, unproductive lands. This policy squeezed approximately 70% of the population into just 13% of the country's land area. 70% of the population into just 13% of the land area, or the country's land area, seizing prime real estate and resources for the white minority. This deliberate spatial engineering was a form of social and economic control. It created a ready-made captive labor force that could be controlled through past laws and a lack of access to basic resources. The townships themselves were unplanned and overcrowded, with minimal infrastructure and amenities, which ensured that non-white populations would be systematically disadvantaged for generations. This policy of forced relocation and marginalization demonstrates that apartheid was not merely about separation, but about deliberate disruption of communities and families for the purpose of maintaining an exploitative racial hierarchy. So let's look at the justifiable injustice of apartheid. So apartheid design for socioeconomic control is powerfully illustrated by quantitative data on the material benefit conferred by racial classification. So One's race determined the benefits they enjoyed during the apartheid regime. So let's continue. A recent working paper provides a compelling measure of this systemic advantage. It estimates that being classified as white under the Population Registration Act led to an average increase of 3.7 years of schooling for men and then 3.9 years for schooling for women. The economic impact was even more pronounced for men as being classified as white, more than triple their income. So this report we are talking about provides a striking hypothetical example. So for over a 40-year working lifespan, a man classified as colored would have earned a lifetime income of 4 million rand, whereas the same person, if classified as white, would have earned 12 million rand. This data provides a powerful and irrefutable measure of the economic benefits of the apartheid system. The fact that an individual's financial fate could be so drastically different based on an arbitrary bureaucratic racial classification demonstrates how deeply institutionalized and ruthless the system apartheid was. The economic disadvantages were not an accidental byproduct of apartheid. They were a central designed outcome, linking the abstract law of racial classification to a life-altering financial outcome. So let's look at education as a tool of oppression and control during the apartheid regime. So the apartheid education system was an explicit mechanism for maintaining social stratification and economic exploitation. So it was meant for maintaining social stratification, differences or separation, and economic exploitation. That was the education system during the apartheid regime. So the Bantu Education Act of 1953 was created not to provide a separate and equal education, but to actively ensure that black students received an inferior curriculum designed to limit their potential and keep them in the working class. The state funding priorities underscore this intent, with most money going to white schools, creating immense disparity in the quality of education and resources. This resulted in an average teacher-to-pupil ratio of 1 to 39 in black schools, compared to 1 to 18 in white schools. Non-white students face not only a lower quality of primary education, but also significant barriers to higher education. They were prohibited from attending established universities, and the government created new ethnic universities college with limited financial aid. These educational policies ensured a perpetual supply of cheap, unskilled labor for the white-dominated economy. This shows that the education system was a primary instrument for both political and economic exploitation, and a key pillar of the overall apartheid system. So let's look at a glimpse into the humiliation and fear of daily life during the apartheid system. So beyond the statistics and legal codes, the human toll of apartheid is best understood through personal experiences. These stories reveal the psychological and emotional trauma inflicted by the system on a daily basis. The life of a grandmother referred to as Gogo illustrates the constant fear of the past laws. She had to hide in Kabul to evade the past inspectors, who would beat and imprison those without the proper documentations. Her daughter, growing up in a township, was forbidden from using a cup in her white employer's kitchen and was forced to drink from a jam jar that her mother had cleaned for her. These micro-level manifestations of systemic humiliation shows how deeply dehumanizing the laws were. Children under apartheid often grew up separated from their parents, who had to work far away in the white areas to support their families, creating a lasting emotional distance. The threat of state violence was a constant reality. The brutal police response to protesters such as the Sharpeville massacre in 1960 and the Soweto uprising in 1976 instilled a deep-seated fear and contributed to a militant response from a new generation of activists. So this anecdote evidence provides a critical counterbalance to the statistical data connecting the systemic oppression to the individual experience of fear, family separation, and psychological subjugation during the apartheid regime. So let's look at the evolution of internal resistance during the apartheid. How the apartheid was eventually succumbed. So the struggle against apartheid was a long and complex process, beginning well before the Nationalist Party took power. So the resistance started long before the National Party or Nationalist Party came to power. So opposition by black South Africans to white rule had been ongoing since 1910, but resistance intensified after 1948, when the new government effectively blocked all legal and non-violent avenue for political protest. In the 1950s, the African National Congress, the ANC, initiated a mass mobilization known as the Defiance Campaign, which involved non-violent protest, boycott, and strikes. A major turning point came on March 21st, 1960, with the Sharpeville massacre, where South African police opened fire on a crowd of unarmed protesters, killing 69 and wounding 186. In response, the government declared a state of emergency and outlawed the ANC and its offshoots, the Pan-Africanist Congress. This event and the perceived ineffectiveness of non-violent methods in the face of escalating state brutality prompted a significant shift in strategy. So if we came in a peaceful manner and you won't heed to our place, they will come the violent way. This is how Nelson Mandela came into the picture. So Nelson Mandela and other leaders who had previously committed to peaceful resistance helped organize a paramilitary subgroup of the ANC called the Umkhonto Sizwe, which meant Spear of the Nation, which began to embrace armed resistance. Another pivotal movement in the domestic struggle was the Soweto uprising on June 16, 1976. When the police massacred thousands of protesting school children, the event ignited a nationwide revolt and brought renewed international attention to the brutalities of the apartheid regime. The trajectory of internal resistance from peaceful protests to armed struggles was a direct consequence of the government escalating repression. The Sharpeville and Soweto massacres were not just isolated events, but were a brutal act of state violence that served to both radicalize the internal opposition and catalyze the global condemnation. So let's look at how the international community contributed to the end of apartheid. So the internal resistance was amplified by a powerful global campaign to isolate the apartheid regime. The international community, shocked by the Sharpeville massacre, began to take decisive action. The London-based anti-apartheid movement, founded in 1959, launched consumer boycott and campaigned for the complete isolation of South Africa. So the London-based anti-apartheid movement efforts, with the support of students, trade unions, and political parties, led to significant victories, including South Africa's forced exit from the Commonwealth in 1961 and its expulsion from the Olympic Games in 1970. So international sanctions also mounted over time. In 1962, the UN General Assembly passed a non-binding resolution calling on all its member states to impose a trade boycott on South Africa. And in 1963, the UN Security Council called for a partial arms ban. The campaign gained significant momentum in the 1980s, culminating in the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986, which passed by the US Congress over President Reagan's veto and imposed significant trade sanctions against South Africa. The success of this international campaign was a complex interplay of grassroots activism and high-level geopolitics. Internal events like the Sharpeville and Soweto massacres served as a crucial catalyst, transforming abstract opposition into widespread international outreach that activist groups could use to rally public support for consumer boycotts. The end of the Cold War rendered the apartheid regime's primary defense as a bulwark against communism obsolete, removing a key justification for Western powers to quietly support it. This shift in geopolitical landscape, combined with the severe economic pressures from both internal and external boycott, created an untenable situation for the regime, with the South African economy struggling and the value of the rand drastically declining. So the convergence of these internal and external pressures ultimately created the conditions for a negotiated end, of apartheid, a negotiated end of apartheid. So let's look at the transition to democracy. So the convergence of pressure and the path to negotiation by the late 1980s, the cost of maintaining apartheid had become unsurmountable. The South African economy was struggling under the dual burden of internal and external boycott and the high cost of its military commitment, including its illegal occupation of Namibia. In 1989, South African Prime Minister Pieter Willem Botha resigned, having lost the faith of the ruling National Party. His successor, F.W. de Klerk, recognized that the regime was no longer economically or politically viable and began to take pragmatic steps towards change. The decision to negotiate was not an act of benevolence, but a recognition that the regime was no longer sustainable. The end of the Cold War rendered the primary justification for internal support obsolete, removing a key political ally in the West. The mounting pressure from sanctions combined with sustained internal unrest created a situation where the cost of maintaining apartheid had become greater than the cost of ending it. So in this scenario, the best way was to end it. So on February 1990, F.W. de Klerk lifted the ban on the ANC and other opposition groups, and most significantly released Nelson Mandela after 27 years imprisonment. So let's look at the path to power sharing, negotiations, and compromises. So the period from 1990 to 1993 was characterized by a series of tense bilateral and multi-party negotiations that led to the groundwork for a new democratic South Africa. Key early agreements such as the Groot-Shaw Minute and the Pretoria Minute were a crucial first step in establishing a framework for substantive talks. Official multi-party negotiations began in December 1991 with the Convention for a Democratic South Africa. So throughout the process, Nelson Mandela remained a central figure, unafraid to confront F.W. de Klerk and denounce his regime as illegitimate. The negotiations were a delicate balancing act between the ANC's demand for full majority rule and the National Party's desire to protect the interests of the white minority. The talks, which were often offset by political violence, ultimately led to the landmark agreement for South Africa's first multiracial general election, a 5-year coalition government, and a new interim constitution. A key compromise made by the ANC was its agreement to safeguard the jobs of white civil servants, a strategic concession that helped secure the transition and allay the fear of the white minority. This demonstrates that the transition was a managed process of negotiation, not an overnight revolution, and it set the stage for the enduring challenges of post-apartheid governance. So let's look at the 1994 South African election. So the culmination of this long and arduous process was the country's first non-racial democratic election on April 27, 1994. The election was won by the African National Congress, the ANC, and Nelson Mandela became the country's first black president. This election was the symbolic and legal end of the apartheid regime and represented a profound shift in power from white minority to black majority. The election of Nelson Mandela was not merely a change in leadership. It was the legitimization of the anti-apartheid movement and its vision for a democratic, non-racial South Africa. It was a globally recognized event that symbolized a major step in the global shift towards democratic rule. So let's look at the legacies of apartheid in modern day South Africa and the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So in an attempt to deal with the atrocities of the past, the South African government established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 1995, chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a globally recognized model for restorative justice, operating as a third way between retributive justice and national amnesia. The Commission's mandate was to investigate human rights abuses from 1960 to 1994, with the core objective of promoting reconciliation and forgiveness by offering perpetrators conditional amnesty in exchange for full disclosure of their crime. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission heard from over 21,000 victims and granted 849 amnesties, with the aim of providing a public historical record of the past. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's legacy, is a complex and deeply contested one. Its mandate was fundamentally a political compromise, as the amnesty provision was deemed essential to persuade the apartheid regime to cede power. However, this provision clashed with the victims' desire for justice and accountability. Many victims felt that the process was weighed in favor of perpetrators, believing that justice was a prerequisite for reconciliation. The ANC also criticized the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for its perceived artificial even-handedness in equating the violence of the state with the actions of the liberation movement. Perhaps the most significant challenge of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's legacy has been the failure of the post-apartheid government to fully implement its recommendations, particularly regarding reparations. This inaction has left many victims feeling cheated, betrayed, and marginalized, as the abusers received amnesty while they were left with broken promises. This shows that while the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a notable effort to address the past, its promises was ultimately undermined by political expediency and a failure to address the material consequences of its work. So let's look at the persistency of inequality in modern South Africa or post-apartheid. So the legal end of apartheid did not automatically correct the profound economic and social stratification it created. Today, South Africa is considered the most unequal country in the world, with approximately 10% of the population controlling 80% of the wealth. The racial disparities in income remain staggering, with the average monthly income for black households being approximately 10,554 rand compared to 117,249 rand for white household. This was done in 2014. So the unemployment rate remains extremely high at 31.9% as of 2023, with disproportionate effect on the black population. So the land reform program, a cornerstone of the post-apartheid government's effort to address historical injustices, has largely failed to meet its goals. The ANC's initial goal to redistribution 30% of the land from white to blacks was not met, with only 8% reallocated by 2010. As of 2017, a staggering 72% of the nation's private farmland were still owned by the 9% white minority or white population. This failure is a powerful example of the government's inability to successfully address the core economic injustice of the past. Educational disparities also persist, perpetuating a cycle of inequality. While schools are no longer legally segregated, historical white schools remain vastly better resourced, with ambitious black parents often paying high fees to send their children to these formerly white institutions. This phenomenon, often referred to as de facto segregation, is tied directly to socioeconomic status. The academic concept of opportunity hoarding provides a framework for this reality. Dominant groups maintain their status by controlling access to these to scarce resources, in this case, well-resourced schools and economic networks. This ensures that the perpetuation of inequality, regardless of the legal framework, still persists post-apartheid. So let's look at the challenges of social cohesion in modern South Africa or post-apartheid. So decades after the end of apartheid, South Africa has yet to emerge as a truly socially cohesive nation. The geographic and social divisions created by law like the Group Areas Act were so deeply ingrained that they continue to shape society today in South Africa. People still live apart geographically and socially along racial, ethnic, and class lines. High levels of inequality, unemployment, and protest are negatively correlated with social cohesion. and a prevailing perception that inequality has not improved since 1994 is a key impediment to interracial trust and integration. So the lack of social cohesion is not an abstract problem, but a direct consequence of persistent inequality and a lingering lack of trust. The social divisions and inequality that were entrenched by the apartheid system continue to erode social relations and foster a sense of injustice among communities. The geographic separations of communities and the persistence of separate social spheres for different racial groups highlight the profound psychological and social legacy of apartheid, demonstrating that the structural violence of the regime continues to define landscape of modern South Africa. So in conclusion, the analysis presented in this presentation demonstrate that apartheid was more than a policy of racial segregation. It was a totalizing legal, social, and economic system carefully designed to entrench white minority rule and exploit the non-white majority. This system, built on a long history of discriminatory legislation, systematically created profound, quantifiable inequality in wealth, education, and opportunity. While it was ultimately dismantled through the courageous effort of both internal resistance movements and a powerful global campaign of isolation, its effects were so deeply embedded that they continue to shape the country's social and economic landscape even this day. The South African experience stands as an enduring and cautionary tale. It shows that while a democratic government and a constitutional Bill of Rights can dismantle the legal framework of an oppressive system, the structural violence and economic injustices it created are not so easily erased. The persistent racial inequality, the challenges of land reforms, and the incomplete promise of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission all underscore that the struggle for true equality and reconciliation is an ongoing process. South Africa's journey from apartheid to a democratic state is a testament to the power of human resilience and collective action. But its ongoing challenges are a sober reminder that the legacy of an institutionalized racism requires a continuous and concerted effort to overcome. So end today's episode here. Apartheid. Indeed, it was a brutal system. Anyway, so if you are new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, and share this video. Don't forget, before we go, one day our lives will become history. What will posterity say about you? See you in the next episode.